Jobs are still very gendered in society. There hasn't been a huge change in the occupations associated with masculinity and femininity in the last 30 or 40 years. It's quite difficult for individuals sometimes to be the only one, to feel that kind of chill factor of stepping outside of a gender role. There's really a very strong sense of identity between jobs, tasks, and gender. Tripping over those job boundaries, those identity boundaries, I think is still difficult for individuals. So we have to, as a society, make that easier.
But I think we all have preconceived ideas about what particular workers look like. So when we think of a nurse, we think of a woman. When we think of a team on a building site or a team of refuse collectors, we think of men. And when we think of a CEO or a vice chancellor or the commander of the police of counter-terrorism, we think of a man. I run classes for trainee personnel, for HR managers, and some of these things come up there. When they were asked to select people for a role play for a leadership team, they tended to select the male students. And when we've done job evaluation exercises, jobs that are typically female were evaluated below those that are typically male. So these ideas are kind of very strong within us, and they affect how people behave. And I think breaking the mould, obviously that's what we have to do, but how do we do that? I think we need lots more women in those jobs that are high-end jobs and those jobs that are typically male jobs.
Well, being a woman has obviously affected my career because on the whole, I worked in, initially anyway, I worked in a male-dominated industry, which is current affairs television, where there were hardly any women at all. So we constantly had to fight against the alpha males who thought that they were more important and should get the better jobs. I deliberately didn't put myself forward for the softer subjects, like things like family issues, poverty, housing. On reflection, perhaps I should have done, because obviously I would have done a better job than the men on that probably. But I was keen not to be seen, not to be pigeonholed that I was doing certain subjects because I was a woman.
I've had moments in my career as a lawyer and as an MP where I feel I have been at a disadvantage because of my sex. But I think that in those sorts of situations, you can use your skills to get round it. And one of the things about women is, you know, we're seen to be, if we challenge things, we're always described as feisty or difficult. Whereas if a man challenges things, they're seen to be leaders, you know, and they have gravitas. But we also have skills that can change things, and we do things in a slightly different way.
So, to further increase the diversity of the workforce and get more women into higher positions, we've got to do something about the pipeline. Simply having more women in lower grades or middle grades doesn't necessarily mean they're going to end up in the higher grades if we still have these things like part-time penalties and motherhood penalties and an assumption that if you're working part-time, you know, your focus is elsewhere. So we've got to help people progress through the ranks.
There was improvements in the industry during the 20 years I worked there. I was very involved in the ACTT Women's Committee, and we used to do lots of work around those issues. But I do remember when I was the shop steward bringing my baby to a meeting with management and then being told afterwards that I wasn't able to bring the baby in future because one of them had been disconcerted by the fact that I was discreetly breastfeeding at one point during the meeting. So this was hopeless. I don't think that would necessarily happen today, I hope not, but those are the sorts of things you had to put up with.
I used to work in radio advertising a very long time ago, and you receive commission on the basis of your sales, and I had the highest sales in the team, but I didn't earn the most money, and I was told that this was because my male peers had a family to provide for. So that seems quite shocking and wrong at the time, but I didn't quite know how to articulate that. That's kind of, you know, this is the mid-80s really. And And I don't suppose those things are said to people overtly anymore in the workplace. But what that shows is a kind of historical breadwinner legacy. The idea that men should earn more than women because they have a family to provide for. And that isn't stated overtly anymore, but the legacy of that is still there in the way grades are shaped, working patterns are created. Some of the old collective bargaining has kind of still underlies what we value in terms of job roles and tasks. When women came into the labour market en masse in the 1970s, a lot of part-time roles were created, particularly in things like retail, leisure, caring. Again, that idea that men were working a full-time wage and that women would fit in a bit of work around childcare or elder care responsibilities. Things have changed in the last 20 years. Most households without two people working are more likely to be in work poverty. So there's a pressure on for women to contribute to the household finances, and of course women want to use their skills and expertise in the workplace. But many of the roles that they are still doing now, the kind of traditional feminised roles, caring, customer service, clerical work, cashiering, cleaning, the 5 C's as we call them, are still offered on a kind of default part-time basis. So we did some research in 2014 which shows on average over 60% of all the jobs that women tend to do in those places where they are most prevalent, 5 C's, or about over 60% are only offered on a part-time basis. What we're finding is that many part-timers have multiple jobs, multiple part-time and or casual jobs with the same employer, trying to build a kind of full-time wage, trying to build a kind of stable amount of earnings. Because of occupational segregation and the over-concentration of women in part-time work, and part-time work adhering to the lowest grades in occupational structures, clearly we will have gender pay gaps unless or until men and women are better represented across occupational groups and throughout grades.
And the gender pay gap, the biggest driver of the gender pay gap is the different distribution of women in the occupational hierarchy of the organisation. So you've got women clustered at the bottom rather than being evident at the top. And a lot of the narrative reports that organisations that are producing with their gender pay gap are very clear that they don't think it's pay inequality. It's a problem with where women are in their organisations.
There's no doubt that being female made it more difficult to get promoted. None of the three of us ever got promoted to become producers on World in Action. We were always researchers, which was a very, nevertheless, a very important position because we didn't have any on-screen reporters, so we did that job. But it was frustrating not to be in charge. Nevertheless, so I had to leave Granada in order to get promotion and to go freelance and then go to the BBC, where there were some other women producers, but it was hard. It was hard, particularly once I had a family. It was very hard.
Shows that it really matters who's at the top, not particularly that they're male or female, but they take ownership of equality issues. It's by having somebody at the top that's really pushing for this and is committed to it, and also having effective role models, on the shop floor, and effective advocates for it on the shop floor, that actually make the difference in practice. So it doesn't matter what equality policies and practices you have, if you haven't got the people at the top who are committed to implementing them and making sure that they work, those practices won't work.
So when I was a lawyer, I started off as a solicitor in a firm where 80% of the lawyers were male and 20% were female, and I ended up on the board of directors and I led a diversity and equality programme, and I was determined to see that change, and what I was aiming for was 50-50, but in fact by the time I left that job in 2015 we'd almost reversed it entirely. So we had about 70% women in leadership positions, senior positions, and 30% men. And lawyers and non-lawyers. And then I went into Parliament, and I went into a Parliament that is male dominated, And in 2015, the figures weren't great, but in 2017, for example, the Labour Party now has 45% female MPs, which is by far and away the best figure compared to the other parties. So the nearest other party is 21%. So we've made huge inroads, and part of that has been things like all women shortlists and positive training and action for women to get them involved. Being a female in this job and in my previous job is something that you're marked out for because you're unusual. And I think you can let that bother you and frustrate you and put barriers in front of you, or you can try and beat it. And I've always tried to beat the system, but at the same time make sure that women coming behind me don't face the same barriers.